Hello and welcome to the Startups of London podcast. I'm your host Ozan and the founder of Startups of London. Today, I'm joined by Gilad Gershon, co-founder of Tropic. Tropic defines itself as evolving agriculture and sustaining people and planets, and they are on a mission to provide productive and sustainable genetic innovation. But that sounds so fascinating. I know a thing or two as a layman about CRISPR and the technologies. I think they were quite popular a few years ago. But as our audience knows, we mostly work with tech startups with digital apps and feature lots of high-end tech products. So I think it's a refreshing change for us to feature a company like Tropic and have Gilad with us here. So I'm fascinated to see where this conversation leads. Welcome to our chat, Gilad.
Ozan, good morning. Thank you very much for having me. And it's excited to be here.
So would you like to tell us about the company in your own words?
Sure. So Tropic, we're based in the UK. We have a team of about 150 professionals, and we are considered today as one of the leading agricultural genetic companies in the world. And to give more context about that, so our mission as a team, so we got founded about 6.5 years ago with the mission of establishing a world-leading tropical seeds company, basically identifying that there is a real need to invest in agriculture, create new varieties of tropical crops to feed what's becoming almost a majority of humanity. And we saw an opportunity to use some of the most cutting-edge genetic technologies and innovation available in the world, but that has historically been used a lot in, let's call it more Western style crops like corn and soy and cotton, but to bring them to crops that very much interested us, like coffee, banana, and rice. So we established a company and we started to use a suite of genetic tools, and you mentioned CRISPR, that's definitely a very important one of them, in order to create these better varieties of crops. So, for example, I mentioned banana. So banana is a very big, very important crop, and we are today probably on the leading front of how to take the existing banana and through advanced genetics, make it more adaptable to an evolving world where there's more issues associated with climate change, with diseases. So again, in short, we use advanced genetics to create better tropical crops.
I have two different threads of questions. One of them is about actually the interesting stuff about building a company in this space, how it works. So we will dive into that. But before we do that, I also would like to just explore for a few minutes the more ethical and perhaps the political, social aspects of this. There's a certain amount of fear that usually comes with genetic modification, GMOs, etc. So, but one of the ideas, and I would love you to expand on that for us, that really changed how I thought about this was human beings have always genetically modified the crops they were using, right? The original banana, if you go 100 years, is nothing like, or like 200 years, is nothing like the banana that we think and see today. It's just like much smaller plant with a smaller edible bit. And it's true for everything else. So we have been actually genetically modifying through a method of selective breeding, I guess. So we are still doing that, but now we are using different tools. So the first tool being selective breeding, now we have more and more complicated tools, right? So first of all, is that a correct way of looking at this? And if so, could you perhaps do like a little walkthrough for us, for the uninitiated, of the tools that we have historically used up to perhaps CRISPR and what type of advantages, disadvantages, and options they open up for us?
Sure, with pleasure. So I think that there's a lot of true and important things in what you've said, but I think there's also an importance on going through the details, because I think the language that we use is quite important, and there is let's call it regulatory implications there. So if we do kind of a long stride through history. So you mentioned breeding, and breeding is something that humans have been doing for a very long time. So some would theorize, started about 13,000 years ago with the the first steps of agriculture, people have been planting seeds and every year taking the seeds or the plants that, look better, have a bigger grain or texture and replanting them. And so over thousands of years, knowingly or unknowingly, humanity has bred and created crops that are quite different from what they used to be thousands of years ago. And if you want one example, wheat. So the wheat that we grow today is, if you look at the original wheat, which is interestingly coming from, I think the part of the world that both of us were born is very different from what we would see today, growing in the fields here in the UK. So this is breeding. Over the last couple of centuries, it became more and more sophisticated. So people understood the genetic mechanisms behind it and were able to breed or use this type of sexual breeding more in a more sophisticated way with better impact. Now, so far for breeding, it still is continuous. There's a lot of breeding all over the world today, and it's a very important practice. Now, around 1950s, 1960s, there was a new set of technologies that were introduced around the genetic engineering. So for the first time, people had the tools and the understanding on how to change the genetic makeups of different crops using biotechnology. And later on, I think you mentioned the concept of genetic modification or GMO. That kind of was a general name for that practice. For example, what we think about today a lot of the time as GMO, genetic modification, is in scientific talk, it would be called as transgenesis. It's basically the practice of taking genes from one organism and transferring those genes in transgenesis into another crop or another host, which is not necessarily sexually compatible. So, for example, taking a gene that conveys some sort of disease resistance from a bacteria and transferring it to corn.
To make it more weather durable, resistant for infestations, and increase the yield. So basically increase productivity as just any business would do in a way, yeah?
Yes. So this is the science that started probably in the 1950s, 1960s. Don't catch me on it because I'm not a scientist nor am I a historian of science. But what we saw is probably closer to the 1980s, 1990s, that more and more of these types of products have made it to the market. And I think at the time there was an issue that some of the big companies that develop these products, which I have to say, I think are very important products, and probably today around 12% of global agriculture has this GMO classification or transgenic traits, which are very important because they do create a lot of food and feed a lot of people around the world. But I think for possibly, let's call it the mistakes of the past, I think some of these companies could have done better in communicating to the public the science behind it, or better explained, it did create some backlash. And I think people were surprised to find out about this transgenes in their food. And while I will say today that it's clear that the benefit of that technology was great, around the time the regulators responding to the challenges in the public created sets of regulations that make it today very, very hard to bring these types of new products to the market. So we're talking about can be about 15 years or $150 million of investment, which is, I think, one of the outcomes of that is that if you look today at these types of technologies, they've been primarily developed in some of the crops that I've mentioned, corn, soy, cotton, etc. So very, very, very large crops that justify $150 million investment in creating new products. And subsequently, where we see the uses in countries where these crops are quite big, for example, in the USA. Now, over the last decade or so, there's been, I want to say, an important development in the life sciences field with the introduction of several new technologies known colloquially as gene editing, and specifically CRISPR, which is probably one of the leading tools there. But for the first time, it allowed us to do these type of genetic changes in crops. First of all, very much easier than in the past, more sophisticated, more precise, but also in the way that does not require us to bring foreign DNA from another host. So it's not transgenic. We don't take genes from a different host and bring them to our crop. So we call it gene editing, and it's different from genetic modification because genetic modification is a regulatory classification that basically
This is very
puts you in the
important.
category. It's very important because if we are GMO, then it's 15 years and $150 million. But if we are non-transgenic, and today many countries consider this as non-GMO, so our way to bring it to the market is much faster, much cheaper, while still very much regulated and safe. But what we are doing today is not classified in most countries as GMO, so that allows us to bring a product to the market much faster.
Sorry to interrupt. I have some questions about that. You've talked about CRISPR, but for the people who have not heard of it before, I would suggest them to do kind of like an online search and discover it's an amazing technology. But long story short, and please correct me, it is basically a cut, copy, paste type of an editing tool, which actually goes into the DNA, right? Would you like to add something on that so people understand what we're talking about here?
Sure. And then I'm more than happy to come back because I think you mentioned about the impact and the ethics of what we're doing. And I would want to miss the opportunity to talk about that. But CRISPR, and it's truly is a phenomenal technology that became. I first learned around it around 2014, 2013, and came out from a group of researchers from UC Berkeley, the Broad Institute. And it's a tool that allows us for the first time, as you said, more cut, I would say, than paste, but very precisely go inside a cell, a living cell, and cut DNA in a very precise location, allowing us to engineer the DNA of that cell. So, for example, I'll give you a very basic example of one of the things that we are doing in bananas. So bananas are a very large crop. It's the fourth most important food crop on the planet. One of the genes in banana, or a series of genes that the genes in the banana control the browning of the banana, for example, have to peel it. So, browning creates a lot of wastage in bananas. So we're talking about probably about 50% of bananas that get harvested never get eaten because they're wasted in the supply chain or at people's homes. So for CRISPR, we are able to cut that gene and slow the browning of the banana and reduce waste. So this is just one practical example of how CRISPR can work. But I will take us back a couple of steps backwards. So I did mention that with gene editing, making the process, I would say probably just cheaper and faster, was the first sign that we could use these types of technologies in crops that are not just corn and soy. So for us, what really excited us that we can start using it, for example, in banana, in coffee, rice. And these are crops that are tremendously important. Coffee is the most consumed beverage in the world after water. Rice accounts for about 25% of global calorie consumption. So our mission, to a degree, is to bring this type of innovation and use CRISPR in order to feed people who are some of the neediest people, some of the people who need this innovation the most in the world. So from an ethical and for a mission and for a purpose, we feel very strongly about what we're doing. I think we are really making an impact on the world.
I think that was an amazing summary to give me and everyone else an overview of the context in which you're operating, especially how the technology side of it works as well, just as a brief glimpse perhaps. On coffee and rice, is there anything specific that you can tell us in terms of what is being worked on?
Sure. So with pleasure. So let's talk about the rice for a second. Rice is quite interesting. We started to work on rice about 2.5 years ago. And I mentioned rice is very important. The calorie consumption, 25% of global calorie consumption. When we started to work on rice, we spent a lot of time thinking about what do we want to do in rice, because there's a lot of opportunities, but developing each one of these projects can take several years and a lot of investment money. So, for example, the first disease that we're tackling in rice is called rice blast. So rice blast is a fungi that is pretty much present everywhere in the world where you grow rice, from China, India, Japan, the US, etc. The disease, if it's left untreated, it reduces the productivity of the field. But what farmers do today is primarily they use a lot of fungicides, so this chemical fungicides that kill the fungi, but they also have not the best effect on the environment and biodiversity.
And we also ingest it as well at the end, right? Maybe a trace amount, but it still stays there.
I'm less familiar with the kind of the downstream elements of that, but again, I think that we would all appreciate less chemicals in the field for sure.
I see.
So what we do is also this first program that we started in rice was to genetically engineer the rice so that it is more resistant to the fungi independently without the need to use chemicals. So one aspect, as you mentioned, of course, is the reduction of chemical use in the field. And these are chemicals again. And you can imagine how much of these chemicals are used. Secondly, also interestingly, so through that you can increase yield. So for example, the UN calls the rice blast the most important rice disease on the planet. So if you solve for rice blast, you basically can create more food to feed about 60 million people globally every year. And especially today when food prices are very high and there are starting to be shortages in some very large countries of rice, again, we believe that we can really, really make a very positive impact on humanity.
It's also good for the Greenland, the farmable area ratio, as well as making sure the earth itself is sustainable and is not dried up of nutrients in the coming years. So it has a lot of side benefits, I would say, as well.
Absolutely. And we can also tie it to climate change because, even if we didn't have climate change, we want to reduce the use of chemicals and make the field more productive. But now with climate change, we have less water in many places. We have diseases that, previously people knew how to handle them and how to control them. Today, some of these diseases are really getting out of hand. And so we do need good and sustainable tools in order to continue feeding a growing population, but doing it also sustainably with good benefit on the planet.
How about coffee? I have so many questions. I cannot wait to ask them, but I'm also curious about what you're doing on coffee as well. It's just the interesting nature of things. You don't know what you don't know, right? So I would not be able to tell you a thing if you ask me the question, how do I increase the productivity of rice? Because I don't know about the diseases. I don't think people do. So unless they're farmers, etc. So that's really fascinating. How would we increase the efficiency and the yield of coffee or make it better? So I'm really curious to what you're going to say.
Absolutely. And I believe I very much sympathize with you. I think unlike a lot of my colleagues who grew up on farms, I grew up in Tel Aviv in a city. I came to agriculture a lot later in my life. So the last decade of me working in this field, I continue to learn and be very fascinated about agriculture. But coffee is interesting. So I mentioned earlier that coffee is very big. It's the second most consumed beverage globally after water. I think humanity consumes about 2 billion cups of coffee every day.
Wow.
And a massive, massive consumer market. Eventually, we're talking about somewhere between $250 billion a year. Some estimates are even greater than that. But when we go to the field, and this is, I think, some people are aware of it, but it's just absolutely massive. We have about 25 million people globally who make their living from growing coffee. And if you add their families, there's probably another 100 million people. So you have 125 million people in the world who rely primarily on coffee cultivation for their livelihood. And that's more than 1% of humanity. And the reality is that usually many of these farmers and their families are on the poorer end of humanity. So our work in coffee is, again, making the plant add more value. And I'll give you one example of what we're doing. So in our view, that shifts some of the value from the downstream, from the processing to the farmer and allowing them to make more money from the beans that they end up selling so that they can use this money to get better health care, send their kids to school, etc. Now I'll give you one example. So in coffee, we work on a variety or a type of coffee called Robusta, which is about 40% of global production today. And this is the coffee that gets used primarily for instant coffee, correlates to about 40% of global consumption today. Through very precise gene editing, we can make the coffee be a little bit more soluble in water, so you can produce more instant coffee from it. So, for example, what you used to need 10 hectares of land to produce, now you can do it in 9 hectares of land. So it gives the bean more value for the farmer because it can produce more product from it, and it can also reduce the amount of land that is used in order to produce this very, very large commodity.
We can find the genetical component in the DNA of the coffee bean, which makes it more soluble, and change that with CRISPR, and then turn that into a specific seed or bean that is then ideally your product that is sold to the people. Is that how it works downstream, or something different perhaps?
Exactly. So in the coffee bean itself, there is already a compound that makes the beans less soluble. So we use CRISPR to shut that down. So we're not adding anything new. We're basically the stuff that's already there. Now, it's also an example of why CRISPR in this regard is better than breeding. Because you could accomplish the same thing with traditional breeding, but because coffee is a tree, it grows relatively slowly. To accomplish the same thing with breeding, it could take you easily 25, 30 years to get to the product.
Exactly.
With gene editing, it's a lot faster. So we're talking about several years rather than several decades. And especially the rate of change today, we want to fight climate change. We need impact. So gene editing in this way does allow us to bring that change to the farmer. That not let's wait until the time of your grandchildren.
Yeah. I have so many questions for you, and they touch upon different sides of running the business. And I will share a few different ideas and options, and let you choose which direction you would like to explore. One of them is going back to the previous topic we've discussed. This is perhaps touching on the more PR, marketing, branding side of your business, or the reputation side of your business. Is no tool by itself is essentially good or evil, but it's just how people use it, right? It's the same with the atom bomb. It's the same with a knife. You can use it to make a beautiful food or a dinner for you, or you can use it to hurt someone. So it's not the tool itself that is good or bad. It's usually the people and the intentions behind it. So just like that, I think with genetic modification potentials as they've opened up in the previous few decades, and now what has happened was, and I was subjected to this as a student of sociology, I've heard a lot of tales about companies like the Monsantos and the others creating crops that are seedless or that require a certain specific dependency. So just like a virtual product that we buy today would get most of its revenue from a subscription or the add-ons to be able to keep using it, or like the printer, right? We all buy printers that are relatively cheap, but we have to buy those damn cartridges, which are so expensive, and then it creates kind of a dependency. So this amount of criticism has been, I think, one of the scars and the traumas of this industry, and I think people had certain reservations because of that. So this is, I think, one area of complexity of which makes your life, I would guess, more difficult compared to other less complicated businesses. The second area, I think, goes to your customers and your distribution channels as well. A lot of small farmers have been taking the load of, have been feeding the world essentially, if you look back to the last 100 years. But everybody has moved to cities now, and the population who is working with farming has diminished, and the state support is not as strong as it used to be, etc. And now big corporations are running most of the farming operations. So the second aspect of this, from your perspective, is who your customer is. Is it small farmers versus big corporations? How does it change the dynamics? And how does it change your structure to reach out to them? And finally, the third question, I think, is about pricing of the product, which is your products, the seeds or the beans, how do they compare with the competition? Are they seen as this? So are you the Rolex of the seeds? Are you the high-end luxury product? Are you sitting in a place where you are the best value, best price / quality? How does it make sense for them in the long run, etc.? So 3 directions I will let you explore, but one of them is about your clients, essentially. The other one is about pricing and the product. And the first one was about the ethical concerns around the genetical modification and the way that this has been used and how it affects your marketing and PR. So I'll let you choose, but I'm curious to hear all answers.
Sure. These are all very good questions. Let's see how far can we get. So I will say, first of all, on the regulatory side. So I will say, even though we are not regulated as GMOs in the countries where we operate. It doesn't mean that we are not regulated. So we actually work in a highly regulated industry. So there are in every country that we go, whether it's in Southeast Asia, Latin America, the US, Europe, etc. We operate under very clear regulatory guidelines, which are designed in order to ensure that us and other companies in the industry bring good and healthy and safe products to the market. So there is absolute regulations, and we adhere to it 150%. And this is one part of it, but from a public perception, that's complemented and probably even more important than that. So when we set up the company 6.5 years ago, our Northern Star in that regard was very simple: to develop only products that not only are very good for humanity, but also things that we can explain and communicate, to everyone. So I think that when I speak with my mother, for example, I think she understands very easily that I tell her that we are developing bananas that are resistant to the disease that's killing the bananas now, or rice that make the life of the smallholder farmer a lot easier, and he or she can use less chemicals. So this has been our compass, and I think there's a lot of good companies like us today, but also very strong and very good regulators that make sure that only good products make it to the market. So this is one.
Okay.
On the smallholder versus big corporation, I think the reality, what we're seeing is that it's usually a combination of both. So for example, in banana, you might have a lot of farmers, but downstream of that, you have a few big banana companies that buy and distribute it globally. And same is in rice, where you have literally hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers, but there are ways for us that we can approach them more efficiently, sometimes with support of bigger distributors or seed companies. So a lot of the smarts in our business is being able to service the smallholder farmers, which eventually these are the people that will use our products, but being smart about how we are efficient in approaching them, being able to service them itself. So it is a bit of a combination of both. Now, from the product itself, the pricing, I'll give you an example. So when we develop a new product, and for example, I mentioned this disease called Panama disease that's seriously threatening the global banana industry today.
Yes.
Or banana production, the fourth most important food crop. And I would say that we lead the global effort in developing sustainable solutions for that disease. There is a tremendous need because people, businesses and countries that rely on banana production, they need a solution. And so there is a lot of value for us creating in the field. And usually what we do is we think about how much value can we create in the farmer. We then usually make an assumption that we can retain between 40 to 50% of this value through sales. And the farmer we do need to leave a lot of value on the table, because otherwise the farmer would not want to use it. And then depending on the crop, we have different mechanisms on how to capture that value, because you have the banana industry, different from coffee, different from rice, but there are existing business models. We try when possible not to reinvent business models, but actually to use existing mechanisms, especially when you're talking about tens or hundreds of millions of farmers. Innovating on business model can be challenging. So we create value. We assume capturing about 50% of it, whether it's at the point of selling the seed or downstream of that through collaboration with the farmer. There are also existing business models that allow us to capture that value and retain it.
I mean, this is an amazing field, and there's so much to talk about. I have even more questions, but I think we've ran out of time. So let me try to cap things off and finalize with just one last question. When you look at Tropic as a business, as the co-founder and the CEO, what is the big milestone that you see ahead of you? What is that shining star that you're rallying the team towards?
Well, it's very clear for us. We are working now on getting our first product to the market. It's going to be a banana, and we're hoping to see it being planted by farmers in the next 2 to 3 years. So this is for us what everyone is working for today. Getting this first product to the market. There's of course a big pipeline of additional products to follow that, but this is something that we're all working very hard to achieve.
Is there anything you'd like to add? Are you hiring for any new people? Maybe sometimes a quick announcement is usually a good resource for people to reach out to you. Let people know if you have anything to add.
Sure. I'll say something that when we do I think we're quite well known in the life sciences industry, but I would say something that usually surprises everyone when I say it. I think that the UK is probably the best place in the world for a company like us to be. And I would say myself and many of our team, people who came, or the founding team, people who came from either from Israel or from the US. The UK is truly phenomenal because the quality of the talent of the researcher is fantastic. And there is not enough companies here in this space. So we are growing. We've grown over the last 3 years from about 40 people to 150 people, and we'll continue to grow in the future. And so we're always looking for fantastic researchers, business people who are passionate about agriculture and sustainability, the seed business. And, we'll be happy to speak with people who are looking for new opportunities.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for joining the chat today. I've enjoyed our conversation, and I'll leave this conversation becoming more curious about what you're building here, and we'll definitely follow up on how it's going to hopefully I'll eat one of your bananas or drink one of your coffees one day. Fondly remember this moment as well. Thank you, Gilad, for joining today.
That would be amazing. And thank you very much, Ozan, and for the listeners. Thank you.